Thank you, everyone. So, there is an interesting phenomenon in linguistics known as the false friend, or faux ami. The term has come to describe when one word in a given language is similar, either in appearance or sound, to another word in a different language, but the two differ significantly in meaning. When I asked German colleagues if they were coming to an event and was told, eventuell, I took this to mean they would eventually come and thought, great, see you later, only to wonder why they never came around. The word eventuell in German, of course, means maybe. I think it is important to note that this basic concept can be extended beyond the realm of linguistics, and it is of particular importance to consider when we speak of historical performance practice. Terms, notational devices, and aesthetical matters in general have changed so much throughout history that it would be a mistake on our part to assume their familiarity to our modern musical vocabulary indicates a common treatment historically. I would like to therefore spend the next few minutes addressing one particular case regarding horns and the use of the term stopped, or Gestopft in German, bouché in French, chiuso in Italian, etc. These terms are very familiar to modern horn players and designate a specific effect rendered by the horn player by completely blocking the opening inside the bell. These terms appear frequently in historic sources as well, but in a vastly different context. Initially, the term was used to describe how non-harmonic tones were produced with the hand. The bell was stopped, closed, plugged, etc., thus changing the horn's pitch. Since the technique was inherent to the instrument, the term was not really used as a performance indication. An A-flat had to, due to the nature of the instrument, be stopped. From the very earliest sources on, horn students were told to even out the differences between open and stop tones as much as possible, and a closed note would certainly not have, if played by a good player, produced a stark contrast in timbre. This does not mean that, at the time, they were unaware of our modern brassy stopped effect. Overblowing closed notes changes the timbre drastically, and horn players throughout the hand horn period worked to avoid it. In 1793, Otten van den Broek writes in his Traité Général, quote, "Today in orchestras, we only hear noise made by horns, and mainly we give them all the semitones that is possible to give other instruments. The notes stopped on the horn in forte have the effect of a brass sound or even a cauldron," end quote. These concerns were not limited to any one national style of horn playing. We see in the works of German pedagogue Franz Josef Fröhlich that east of the Rhine, horn players were also concerned about the quality of the timbre on closed notes. While the source of Fröhlich's knowledge of the horn is unclear, his writings demonstrate a profound familiarity with the instrument. In his Hornschule from 1811, he writes, quote, "In particular, one should be careful not to exert too much effort on the stop notes, as this produces the most unpleasant sounds." In his later work, Systematischer Unterricht from 1829, he goes into more detail on the subject. Quote, "It is not uncommon that a stop note should be articulated firmly with force. This, however, creates a highly unpleasant sound because the player does not have the time to give the stop tone the fullness of sound it is lacking." He later adds, quote, "It is not good to emphasize the stop notes with sforzando, which sounds very, once again, unpleasant, unangenehm. Everything should then be sotto voce or piano pianissimo." This general aversion to overblowing closed notes led to their near total omission in the orchestral repertoire of the classical era. There's an article coming out later on that. Moving on, Fröhlich goes on to write, quote, "Here one can really see how the muted tones serve excellently to express the deepest, most intimate feelings, and how precisely the muted tone, such as an A-flat and an E-flat, creates this indescribable effect. The performer understands to pour out his soul in it with that warmth and truth, without which, of course, everything remains cold and meaningless," end quote. Adolf Marx in 1840... one slide too far? Yes. Here's Marx, thank you. Adolf Marx in 1847 writes that, quote, "The half-shaded tones must, especially with good preparation and in the middle and higher registers, be made the same or almost the same as the natural tones by good players, but they differ in an unfavorable way by having a depressed or constrained sound. Completely muted tones sound even more compressed and dull, also somewhat nasal, if not remedied by good preparation. We find reassuring consistency in how historic sources describe the effect of close notes. Descriptors such as soft, veiled, dull, shaded, matte, muted, etc. remain how the effect was written about well into the 20th century. The question then is, how did we get from the one meaning to the other? When did the biting, brassy effect first started being incorporated into the instrument? And what does this mean for our attempts to establish any kind of Romantic period performance practice? The invention of the valve revolutionized so much about the horn. No longer was the horn restricted to a rigid layout of open and stopped notes. Like the other brass instruments, the valves allowed all notes to be played as open and free tones. The horn, however, had a whole other effect now available to composers. In an early article in 1835 on the new valve horn, Gottfried Weber writes in the paper Cecilia, quote, "In particular, the horn player has his own variety of effects from connecting hand stopping with the use of valves. Yes, it is now up to the player to play not only every note that could otherwise only be stopped as a natural note, but also vice versa. Every note that he previously only knew as a natural note, now at will as a muted note. Don't take this all for idle musings. On the contrary, it is highly practical. We already mentioned in the introduction that the peculiar timbre of the muted tones and even more peculiar dullness of the double-stopped notes, i.e. fully closed, certainly have their own charm. Even after this, one will not fail to recognize that the instrument has only gained through the valves and has lost nothing of its previous charms and peculiarities. But even more, in fact, it has gained even more from those previous peculiarities in that those sounds, which hitherto were only peculiar to certain individual notes, can now be given to any desired note." End quote. This freedom that the addition of valves brought to the horn was noticed by several authors writing on the new instrument. Hector Berlioz writes along the same lines in his Traité général d'instrumentation, quote, "The cor à piston in the hands of a clever player can give all the close notes of the ordinary horn, and yet more, since it can execute the whole scale without employing a single open note. It is possible on the cor à piston, after having played a passage in open sounds, to repeat it in close sounds like a very distant echo," end quote. Berlioz is an important source for early Romantic orchestral effects. His Traité is a very thorough example of instrumentation instruction and sheds particular insight into how we understood our instrument. We do see the use of closed tones mentioned in connection to particular orchestral effects, but it is interesting to note the context. Quote, "When closed sounds are not written for a particular effect, those at least should be avoided. The sonorousness of which is too weak and too dissimilar to the other sounds of the horn. Of these, the D and the D flat below the stave, the low A and B flat, and the A flat in the stave, which should never be employed as filling notes, but only in order to produce effects inherent from their dull, hoarse, and wild quality of tone." Berlioz goes on to cite early uses of the special stopped effect in opera. Quote, "The low B flat under the stave has been introduced once with excellent dramatic purpose by Weber in the scene of Der Freischütz where Gaspard invokes Samuel. But this sound is so closed and consequently so dull that it is not heard. It is only to be remarked by the whole orchestra suddenly ceasing at the moment of its utterance. Thus, the middle A flat written by Meyerbeer in the nun scene of Robert le Diable, when Robert approaches the tomb to gather the enchanted branch, gains general attention only on account of the silence of almost all the other instruments, and yet this note is much more sonorous than the low B flat. In certain scenes of silent horror, a very great effect may result from these closed notes in several parts. Méhul is the only one, I believe, who has perceived this in his opera Frosin et Melidor. End quote. We see that Berlioz consistently refers to the dullness and lack of sonority of the stopped effect. It does not seem that he is referring to the punchy brassiness we associate with our modern understanding. This does not mean that he was unfamiliar with the effect, however. At the end of the entry, he remarks that even when playing hunting calls, the chaste and reserved voice of the horns do not match the sound of the trompe de chasse. He notes that should one wish to resemble the strident sound of hunting horns, one can force the air, granting the instrument a cuivre effect. Quote, this can sometimes have an excellent effect, even on boucher notes, end quote. This forced boucher-cuivre effect is what eventually became our modern stopped horn. We see that Berlioz was aware of this particular orchestral effect, even if he did not use it all that much, if ever, in his own works. The earliest source I found that discusses the idea of using this cuivre version of closed notes as a dramatical device in music is from an interesting article written on the new valve horn. In 1835, Neue Zeitschrift für Musik, an unidentified author from Ludwigslust writes, quote, but I particularly recommend that composers study the common or natural horn, for up to now its effect has been completely misunderstood and not used. For example, crass things in the opera, the ordinary horn can produce a dreadful hair-raising effect when squeaky stop tones are blown strongly and an accompaniment or solo for 4 different horns chosen in such a way that mostly stop tones are necessary would certainly produce a beautiful effect, end quote. In 1838, Gassner, in his Partiturkenntnis, points out, quote, stop notes are used rarely and then usually only in forte, because in piano they would be matte and dull, but can only be produced loud with force, so they are mainly only suitable for strong passages, end quote. From around this point on, authors start referring to the dual nature of closed notes. Stop notes in piano retained their original timbre from the earlier hand technique and were used to produce a muted or echo effect on the instruments. At the same time, notes indicated as stopped in forte dynamics contrasted severely with the color of the open horn. The most notable champion of this treatment of the stopped horn was unquestionably Wagner. Many texts on composition and instrumentation of the period point to the works of Wagner as the best example of how to write for horns, with the notable exception of his use of quick crook and key changes in the middle compositional period, but we won't get into that. The use of louder stopped horn for a dramatic effect can be found throughout his works. In 1885, Gewert notes, quote, until now, the opposition of the 2 timbres had hardly been used intentionally, except by soloist composers. The scale of stopped sounds serves them to repeat as an echo a cantilena first heard in open sounds. However, some masters of our time, Wagner in particular, have begun to take advantage of the artificial notes of the chromatic horn, but only for isolated chords or accents. When it is a question of a rather long passage, the author of Nebelungen prescribes muting the horns, which gives a similar result, end quote. His handling of the softer variation of close horns differs slightly from earlier treatments. Soft and veiled passages that require a muted effect are now marked con sordino, or mit Dämpfer. Horn mutes have been around since the latter part of the 18th century, so a literal interpretation is certainly possible. It is, however, also possible that the indication con sordino indicates a desired effect rather than a specific execution. In 1897, Hermann Eichborn writes in Die Dämpfung beim Horn, quote, if I have already proved that the hand is necessary to give the horn its specific horn nature, it follows of itself that the mute as an apparatus is not suitable for the horn and is only permitted in certain cases. Most of the time, when the composer wants to use the horn muted in the proper sense, i.e. with a weakened, diminished sound character, the horn, like the pianoforte, should remain muted una corda, or like the violin played con sordino, all of which should not fall out of its own kind. The muting of the old loop, harp, and grand pianos always remain closely related to the character of the instrument. For this reason, horn mutes have not always been used very much, for even hard-of-hearing people who lacked the right understanding of the instrument could not help but dislike the flat, mean, and shrill sound of the mutes. He goes on to concede, quote, But there is a very good reason which prompted one time and again to think about artificial means of achieving an echo or a dampening with the horn, namely that such a muting with the hand at a high caliber has enormous difficulties, end quote. This is likely the reason we see the original softer, matte, and dull stopping techniques start to be phased out. Authors are consistent in describing the positive qualities of the timbre, but the difficulties in projection and intonation could not keep up as priorities shifted from expression and color to precision and intonation. The use of an actual mute simply allows for a more consistent execution with less work involved. Whether the hand or an apparatus, con sordino appears more and more frequently as an effect. The transition away from using the soft boucher effect with the hand continued throughout the century, with the technique being more and more relegated back to the domain of solo settings, which is where hand technique initially began. This softer treatment of playing closed continues to be taught in the methods of horn pedagogues such as Kling, Gumpert, and Franz, all of whom advocate a thorough education in the hand horn, considering it to be essential to any valve horn student's studies. This soft version of stop horn begins to be referred to as echo horn, and the solo repertoire of the period is filled with examples of its use, while its inclusion in an orchestral piece is rare. In the first half of the 20th century, we find different composers writing all sorts of ways to achieve muted effects for horns. There was never a universal standard in how one notates the various effects, and I would argue that even today, such a standard does not exist. The modern concept of a Werktreu execution of a piece exactly as notated with the assumption that this is exactly what the composer intended becomes categorically impossible. What we see instead is a collection of terms that designate effects rather than techniques. Eichborn writes, quote, "The composer is generally not in the least concerned about the nature and nuance of the latter, although the results can be fundamentally different if guided by what the music wants to express in the place in question. This is left to the taste and insight of the players. If they are at all concerned with the execution of muting, the omission of which can by no means be counted against them in the view of the very real and often insurmountable obstacles, stop the horn once and for all by cramming the hand quite deep in the bell, transposing the notes, and each time bringing forth the aforementioned silly, disgusting, tinny sound, which 9 times out of 10 ends up being as senseless and pointless as possible." Our modern method of stopping the horn was historically seen as a rare exception to the general quality of horn sound, to be used sparingly as a special dramatic effect. The transition of how we perceived the effect of the stopped horn changed drastically throughout the 19th century. The very nature of musical notation is that of a starting point, a guide intended to set one on the path to an actual musical performance. More important than any single indication is the actual context, and it is critical that we consider the context when we encounter these terms in order to understand the composer's true intentions. I will leave you with a silly but nevertheless apt analogy. We can compare the brassy, nasal, spicy squeak of an emphasized, fully stopped note to Tabasco sauce. I would argue that context is also critical in informing our decisions of where to apply hot sauce. It would be ridiculous to add Tabasco to ice cream, and even where it is a welcome addition, too much will render the dish unrecognizable. Thank you.